My name is Natalie Hayes. I'm 29, and every Thanksgiving has felt like a stage where I was cast as the disappointment. The chandeliers shone like crowns. The turkey glistened as if perfection could be carved, and yet none of it was meant for me. My father's words always carried the same verdict, that I'd never be more than broke, while my brother was lifted high as the pride of our family. I learned to sit in silence to smile, while my heart ached for a trace of recognition that never came. Year after year, I swallowed that pain until it hardened into something stronger, something they never imagined I could carry. And this year, the silence they mistook for weakness will speak louder than all of their laughter. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. From the outside, it looked like the perfect Hayes family Thanksgiving in the quiet suburbs just north of Chicago. Inside, though, the tension curled around us like smoke, heavy and unspoken. I slid into my usual seat halfway down the long table, far enough from my father that he wouldn't address me directly too often, but close enough that every word still landed. At 29, I should have felt grown-free confident, but in this house I was always 16 again, waiting for someone to strike. My father, Richard, sat at the head shoulders, squared a man who thrived on being watched and admired. He carved the turkey with slow, deliberate movements, as though even slicing meat deserved an audience. To his right, my brother Michael leaned back, cufflinks glinting under the chandelier. He caught my eye with the same smirk I'd known since childhood, the one that always preceded a remark designed to cut me down. My mother Linda fussed with the napkin in her lap, her gaze sliding over me like I wasn't there. The meal began quietly, clinking silver and low chatter about football scores and shopping plans. Then my father cleared his throat, his voice carrying with practiced ease over the table. Some people, he said, pausing long enough to catch everyone's attention, work their entire lives and never rise above being broke. Laughter rolled down the table in a wave, obedient and hollow. Michael grinned, teeth catching the light. My mother let out a thin laugh, more air than sound. Even my cousin Heather, who lived for moments like these, leaned forward with a smirk. At least she's consistent, she added, eyes fixed on me. Takes real talent to stick with it. Heat crawled up my neck, but I forced my expression still. I lifted my fork, cut a neat slice of turkey, and let the flavors dull against my tongue. This wasn't new. I had been the punchline at this table for years. Inside, though, something different stirred. Not rage, not shame, but the calm weight of a secret. They didn't know the contract sitting in my office, the valuation numbers climbing higher with every quarter, the quiet email from Time magazine waiting in my inbox. They thought I was here to be humiliated again. They thought I had come home empty-handed. My father swirled the wine in his glass, watching the crimson liquid coat the crystal as though admiring himself in the reflection. He turned toward Michael, his voice rich with pride. "Now here's a real story of success," he said, raising his glass. "Michael has shown us what dedication and intellect can achieve, a son who carries the Hayes name forward." Applause broke out around the table. Forks tapped against plates. Someone clinked a spoon against a glass to emphasize the toast. My father let the noise swell before he delivered the final line, eyes flicking briefly toward me. "Not everyone is meant for greatness. Some of us were simply born to watch it in others." Michael lifted his own glass high, grinning wide. "To the Hayes family," he declared, "and to making the right choices." I traced the rim of my glass with my finger, the cool stem steady in my grip. My smile was small, sharp, invisible to them. I brought the wine to my lips and drank slowly, letting the bitterness linger as their laughter echoed around me. My father's voice still carried, my brother basked in the attention, and the rest of them played their parts in the performance they called Thanksgiving. I played mine too. Silent, composed eyes, cold as steel. For the first time in years, I wasn't absorbing their cruelty. I was storing it, stacking each word carefully like kindling, knowing there would come a day when the match would strike. The clatter of silverware, the hum of shallow conversation, the bursts of laughter at Michael's stories, they all blurred together. The chandelier glittered above us, casting golden light across polished faces. My father's voice rose again, proclaiming the Hayes family stronger than ever, proud of its legacy, confident in its heir. He lifted his glass once more, sealing the performance with the certainty of a man who believed the world bent toward him. I raised mine too, lips curving into a smile they mistook for surrender, and drank. Inside, the silence grew louder than their words. It was not defeat. It was the beginning. The walls of our house told a story that never included me. Every inch of the staircase was lined with framed photos of Michael, grinning in his basketball jersey, holding up trophies, his report cards mounted like pieces of fine art. My mother dusted them weekly, making sure the glass shone. My father would pause on the steps when guests visited, pointing out each one with the pride of a curator showing off a gallery. It was 2010, I was 15, and the house might as well have been a museum dedicated to my older brother. My name didn't hang anywhere. The one time it almost did, it ended up shoved into a drawer. That spring, I won first place in a statewide art competition. The Peace Bum. A charcoal sketch of the Chicago skyline at dusk had taken me weeks. I'd poured every ounce of myself into the details, the tilt of the rooftops, the last rays of sunlight dissolving into night. My art teacher had cried when she saw it, told me she'd never had a student capture the city with such raw clarity. The award came with a certificate signed by the mayor and an invitation to hang my drawing in a downtown gallery. I carried it home pressed flat against my chest, my heart pounding with a pride that felt brand new. I burst into the kitchen, the certificate trembling in my hands. "Mom, look, I won. My drawing is going to be in a gallery downtown." My mother glanced up from the sink water dripping off her hands. She gave a small smile, the kind you offer a stranger on the street. "That's nice, Natalie," she said, drying her hands on a towel. Then her eyes flicked back to the clock. "But you should really start thinking about something more practical. Art doesn't pay bills." The words hit like cold water. I stood there, certificate still outstretched, waiting for something more. She'd already moved on, muttering about the turkey she needed to defrost for dinner. That night, my father came home with 2 colleagues from his law firm. They stepped inside coats dusted with snow, laughing about some case they'd won. My father beamed, leading them straight to the staircase. "Take a look at this," he said, his voice thick with pride. He pointed to Michael's SAT scores framed in mahogany, then to the basketball team photo. Captain of the varsity team, top 10% of his class. "This boy is headed straight to the Ivy League." The men nodded, impressed, their eyes sweeping over the wall like it was evidence in a trial he'd already won. I hovered nearby, clutching the certificate still rolled in its envelope. For a second I thought maybe this time he'd remember me, remember the gallery invitation. I stepped forward, opening my mouth, but he turned away, clapping Michael on the shoulder. "That's what success looks like," he told his guests. "That's the future of the Hayes family." The envelope sagged in my hand. My sketch might as well have been invisible. Later that evening, I slipped upstairs. I opened my dresser drawer and tucked the certificate inside under a stack of old notebooks. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the plain white ceiling. From downstairs, the sound of laughter rose, glasses, clinking voices praising Michael. I whispered to myself, barely audible. I was never meant to be on that wall. Tears stung my eyes, but I swallowed them down. When I walked past the staircase the next morning, the frames gleamed in the light streaming through the window. My father stopped again, alone this time, hands on his hips. He looked up at Michael's smiling face and nodded with satisfaction. I lingered in the hallway, hoping he might notice me. His eyes never shifted. I turned away, the floor cold under my bare feet, the silence pressing hard against my chest. It was in that moment I understood. My role had already been written. I was not the shining heir. I was the shadow that made his light brighter. And for the first time, I began to wonder what it would take to step out of that frame. The letter had arrived in a thick envelope, heavier than I expected, the logo of the Arizona Tech Incubator stamped proudly across the corner. My hands trembled when I opened it, the words swimming together until I blinked them clear. Accepted internship design program. It wasn't Wharton, it wasn't an Ivy League, but to me it felt like a door opening that no one else even knew existed. I clutched the letter to my chest and imagined just for a moment my parents smiling the way they did when Michael came home with good news. That evening, the dining room glowed with golden light. The table was already set for celebration. Champagne bottles chilled in a bucket, crystal flutes lined up in rows, roast chicken steaming on platters. Michael had received his acceptance to Wharton. My father had announced it like a courtroom victory, pacing the room with pride swelling in every syllable. My mother had called relatives all afternoon, her voice bubbling with excitement as she told them her son would be heading to Pennsylvania in the fall. I walked in, clutching my own envelope, still warm from my grip. I waited for a break in the chatter, waited for someone to notice me. But all eyes were on Michael as he leaned back in his chair, recounting how the admissions officer had called him personally. I slid into my seat, clearing my throat softly. "I got some news too," I began, holding up the letter. My mother glanced at it, distracted, then turned to refill a glass. My father didn't even look up. Only Michael noticed, smirking, as though he already knew what was inside. "What's that?" he asked, voice dripping with false interest. "It's an internship," I said, my words small but steady. "At a tech incubator in Arizona. They accepted me into their VR design program. They think I have potential." The table fell quiet for half a second, the only sound the hiss of bubbles rising in champagne. Then my father barked a laugh, sharp and dismissive. "Virtual reality." He shook his head, turning to his colleagues seated beside him. "My son is heading to Wharton, one of the finest business schools in the country. And my daughter thinks she'll change the world with toys." Heat burned in my cheeks, but I kept my grip tight on the envelope. "It's not toys," I whispered, but the words barely carried. My mother reached across, patting my hand without meeting my eyes. "That's nice, sweetheart," she said, the same tone she used when I told her I'd gotten an A in art class. Then she lifted her glass toward Michael. "But tonight is about your brother. We are so proud." Michael raised his flute high, grinning as champagne sloshed dangerously near the rim. "To Wharton," he declared. The others joined in crystal clinking voices rising in cheer. I lowered my letter, slowly folding it back into the envelope. My chest tightened, the pride I'd felt only hours before dissolving into something heavier. My father's voice cut through the noise, calm and final. "Natalie, I've decided something. The trust fund we set aside for your education will go no further. If you want to chase fantasies in the desert, you'll do it on your own dime. I won't waste another cent on nonsense." The laughter at the table stilled for a moment, then picked back up with renewed force as though his words had been the punchline to a joke. Michael leaned back satisfied while my father toasted again, this time to investing only in real futures. I tucked the letter into my bag, hands trembling. I wanted to scream to tell them this was more than a hobby, that the world was shifting and I was standing on the edge of it. But my throat closed around the words. So I smiled faintly the way I had learned to do and let the sound of their celebration drown me out. The clatter of silverware, the pop of another champagne cork, the shrill laugh of my cousin Heather, all of it blurred into a single hum. I sat still, my envelope hidden, my dreams folded small. And yet beneath the weight of humiliation, something steadier took root. Pain, yes, but also resolve. If they wanted me to do it alone, then I would. If they believed I was nothing more than a shadow, then I would find light somewhere else. The rest of the night passed in a haze of toasts and congratulations meant for someone else. When dessert was served, I slipped away from the table, my bag pressed tight against my side. Upstairs in my room, I laid the envelope on the desk, smoothed it flat, and stared at the bold black letters of my name. It was the only time that day anyone had written it with pride. Downstairs, the voices carried on rising in another round of cheers for Michael. I sat in the silence of my room, one hand resting on the letter, the other curled into a fist. The house was filled with laughter. But for me, the night ended in quiet, a seed of determination buried deep where no one could touch it. The apartment in Phoenix smelled of damp drywall and old smoke. The paint on the walls had peeled back in curls, exposing yellow plaster underneath. At night, the thin walls carried every sound: The neighbors' arguments, the buzz of a faulty light fixture in the hallway, the slam of car doors in the parking lot. I slept on a mattress pushed into the corner, my clothes stacked in suitcases because I couldn't afford a dresser. Most nights I sat cross-legged on the floor with my old laptop balanced on an overturned milk crate. The keys stuck. The fan wheezed like it was choking, but it was all I had. I coded until my eyes blurred, until the blue glow of the screen cut through the darkness like a lifeline. Ramen went cold on the counter, coffee cups stacked like trophies beside me. And still I kept going. The more exhausted I became, the more determined I was to keep building. One evening, as I adjusted lines of code that refused to cooperate, a knock rattled the thin door. I opened it to find Tom Rivera leaning against the frame, a six-pack dangling from his hand. We'd grown up on the same street in Chicago, and somehow he'd followed me here, chasing his own work in software. "Thought you could use some company," he said, stepping inside. His eyes swept over the bare room, the mattress on the floor, the cracked blinds. He didn't say anything about it, just lowered himself onto the carpet beside me. We drank lukewarm beer, and I showed him a rough VR demo, a digital gallery of shifting landscapes and sculptures that seemed alive when you walked through them. He slipped on the headset, adjusted the straps, and after a long pause, grinned. "This feels like the future," he murmured, turning his head slowly, as the room filled with light only he could see. Then he pulled the headset off and met my eyes. "Don't stop, Nat. Whatever you do, don't stop." His words stayed with me long after he left. In early 2017, I scraped together enough cash to buy a booth at a startup fair downtown. It wasn't much. Just a plastic table draped with a wrinkled cloth and a banner printed at a copy shop. I hauled my beat-up laptop in a backpack, my demo stored on a flash drive, praying it wouldn't crash. The convention center buzzed with energy that morning. Booths glowed with sleek screens. Teams in matching polos handed out glossy brochures. Investors strolled by in pressed suits. My setup looked like a child's lemonade stand in comparison. I smiled anyway, adjusting the headset on the table. The first investor stopped for less than a minute. He chuckled, shaking his head. "VR art. Nobody's paying real money for fake paintings," he said, tossing my flyer back onto the table before moving on. The second man didn't even last 30 seconds. "Looks like a toy," he muttered, brushing imaginary dust off his suit jacket. By noon, most people barely glanced in my direction. My throat ached from repeating the same pitch. Sweat dampened my blazer, and I could feel Tom's unease as he shifted beside me. "Maybe they're right," he whispered when no one was close enough to hear. "Maybe it's too niche. You're smart, Nat. You could get an MBA, join a real company." His words sliced through me, not because he meant harm, but because for a moment I almost believed him. What if my father had been right all along? What if this was nothing more than a phase? I stared at the headset lying idle on the table, fighting the urge to pack up and leave. Then a woman in her 50s approached her presence, quieter than the flashy men who had passed by all day. She wore a neat blazer, sensible shoes, and carried herself with calm authority. Without a word, she slipped on the headset. For several minutes she wandered through the gallery I'd built, tilting her head, lingering at details no one else had cared to notice. When she finally removed it, her eyes gleamed. How much, she asked simply. My mouth went dry. "Excuse me, I want the whole collection. Name your price." Tom froze beside me. I swallowed, pulse hammering, and forced a number out that felt impossibly bold. 2.2 million. The woman didn't blink. She nodded once. "Send me the paperwork." I managed to stammer something that resembled agreement as she handed me a card and walked away. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. Tom grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Did that just happen?" I nodded, still staring at the card like it might disappear. My chest felt too small for the rush of air I needed. For the rest of the afternoon, the voices of dismissive investors and the sound of their laughter still rang in my ears. But beneath it all, one truth burned steady. Someone had seen value where everyone else had seen a joke. That night back in my apartment, I sat on the mattress staring at the contract draft on my screen. The glow lit the peeling walls, the stains on the carpet, the stack of ramen wrappers in the corner. My hands hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding with every keystroke. I hit save, leaned back, and closed my eyes. The Civic outside still coughed smoke. My fridge was nearly empty, the rent overdue. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside everything had. By 2018, the contract I had signed at that startup fair had turned into something real, something undeniable. Investors began circling cautiously at first, then with real intent. When the seed round closed at $10 million from a venture capital firm in San Francisco, I could barely breathe as I signed the papers. My father's voice still echoed in my head. Nonsense. Toys broke, but the numbers on the page told another story. The office we could afford was a shabby loft above a laundromat in the Mission District. The carpet smelled faintly of detergent, the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the furniture was whatever we could find secondhand. 5 of us crammed into the space, me 2 engineers straight out of Berkeley, a designer who slept on her cousin's couch, and Tom who had left his stable job to join me full-time. We sat on plastic chairs that cracked if you leaned too far back, our laptops lined up on an old wooden table that bowed under the weight. And yet the place buzzed. The hum of code being typed, the smell of instant noodles, the whiteboard covered in equations and sketches that bled together like graffiti. Every detail pulsed with a kind of chaos that felt alive. We worked until the sunrise bled through the dirty windows, and then we worked some more. One night as I rubbed at my burning eyes, Tom leaned back his chair, squeaking. "You realize we're held together by duct tape and caffeine, right?" he said, half smiling. "Yeah," I answered, tapping at my keyboard. "But duct tape can build bridges if you layer it enough." We laughed, and then we kept coding. Word spread. A hospital in the Bay Area asked if we could demonstrate how our VR platform might help stroke patients during rehabilitation. It was our first chance to prove this wasn't just art or entertainment. I remember the day vividly, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the echo of footsteps down polished hallways, the skeptical look of the lead physician as he crossed his arms in front of our setup. "You think this can help them walk again?" he asked. His tone was flat, bordering on dismissal. "Not by itself," I admitted, "but it can retrain their brains to visualize movement, to connect neurons that have gone dormant. It gives them hope." He hesitated, then agreed to try. We fitted the headset onto a patient in his late 50s, his left side weakened from a stroke months earlier. The moment the virtual environment lit up, he gasped softly. His arm trembled, fingers twitching as he reached out for shapes floating in the digital air. On the monitor we all saw it. Tiny sparks of movement, clumsy but real. The physician's eyes widened. He leaned forward, watching every flicker of the man's hand. When the session ended, he pulled off the headset and blinked hard, his voice low, almost reverent. This could change everything. He turned to me, eyes shining in a way that made my chest ache. "Do you know what this means for my patients?" I swallowed, nodding. For the first time, my work wasn't just pixels or polygons. It was flesh and blood. It was possibility. The hospital signed a pilot contract on the spot. As I shook the physician's hand, my own fingers trembled. That evening, back in our loft, the team cheered so loudly the laundromat owner downstairs banged on the ceiling with a broom. We ordered cheap pizza, our celebration as messy as our office. Tom raised a slice high like a toast. "To visionary realms," he said, his grin wide. The name sounded foreign then, too big for our tiny space, but it stuck. Later that night, as the others dozed off in their chairs, I stepped outside onto the narrow fire escape. The San Francisco air was damp, the city lights flickering below. I pulled out my phone thumb, hovering over my father's number. For one fleeting second, I imagined telling them all, that I had built something worth noticing. Then I locked the screen. Not yet. Not until the proof was undeniable. The next day, as I sat hunched over my laptop, Michael's name flashed across my phone. Against my better judgment, I answered. Still playing with VR, he asked, his tone light mocking. I just signed $100 million deal with my firm. Real money, real work. Thought you'd want to know what actual success looks like. I bit down hard on my tongue, forcing myself to sound calm. Good for you, Michael. He chuckled, satisfied. Try not to burn out chasing fantasies. Then he hung up. I stared at the screen long after the call ended, anger simmering low in my stomach. But underneath it, steadier than the anger, was resolve. Let him boast. Let my father laugh. They had no idea what we had just done in that hospital room. The team trickled back into the office that evening. Dark circles under their eyes, but fire in their expressions. We had contracts to draft code to refine endless hours ahead of us. I slid the hospital agreement onto the table. The others leaned in silent for a beat, then erupted in cheers once more. For the first time I felt it fully, we weren't building toys anymore. We were building hope. By 2019, our little loft above the laundromat had become a memory. Visionary Realms had grown into a glass-walled office downtown San Francisco, the kind of place where sunlight spilled across whiteboards crammed with ideas and every desk hummed with energy. We had more than 100 employees now. Engineers, designers, project managers, interns buzzing around with lattes and laptops. Investors had poured in $25 million for our Series A, then $120 million for Series B. By the time Series C closed at $400 million, the valuation had hit $2.5 billion. Numbers I once couldn't imagine now appeared on term sheets with my name signed at the bottom. Walking through the office, hearing the click of keyboards and the murmur of brainstorming sessions, I felt pride catch in my throat. This was no longer duct tape and ramen. This was real. And yet at home, nothing had changed. During a family Zoom call that spring, the screen filled with familiar faces. My parents in their immaculate living room in Chicago, Michael calling in from a sleek Manhattan apartment with skyline views behind him. My father leaned toward the camera, his voice carrying the same sharpness it always did. Michael just closed on his second condo in Tribeca, he announced proudly. Now that's the kind of investment that builds a future. I smiled faintly, sipping water, waiting for the inevitable. Then he turned to me. And you, Natalie, still driving that old Civic? Still renting? For all the work you say you're doing, what do you really have to show for it? Michael chuckled softly, adjusting his tie as if to punctuate the moment. I wanted to scream that my company was worth billions, that contracts sat on my desk, with signatures inked in permanent marker, that my employees believed in me enough to bet their careers on what we were building. Instead, I pressed my smile in place and said, I'm doing fine, Dad. He leaned back, clearly unimpressed, and shifted the conversation back to Michael's latest success. I sat quietly listening to their voices wash over me, feeling the weight of everything I wasn't allowed to say. Around the same time, rumors began to reach me about Michael's firm. Insider trading investigations, whispers of shady deals. I read the articles in silence, scrolling late at night in my office. His name wasn't mentioned directly, but I knew enough to recognize the trail of smoke curling toward him. My father, of course, dismissed it all. Nonsense, he snapped when I asked, gently testing the waters. Michael's firm is untouchable. Don't believe gossip. But the gossip didn't stop. It spread through the finance press, murmurs turning into headlines, colleagues of Michael's quietly resigning. My father fought to shield him the same way he always had, defending his son's reputation like it was his own. I didn't bring it up again. It wasn't my battle to fight. In late 2020, we secured a meeting with representatives from the Department of Defense. They wanted to explore how VR could be used for training simulations, immersive environments to prepare soldiers without risk. The gravity of it shook me. This wasn't art. This wasn't even medicine. This was the government, the kind of contract that could define a company for decades. I wore my best blazer, the one suit I owned that actually fit, and walked into the meeting with my team. The conference room buzzed with official suits and uniforms, notebooks open and pens poised. My palms were slick with sweat as I explained our platform, demonstrating the environments we'd built. Desert landscapes for navigation, virtual aircraft cockpits for drills, scenarios that shifted in real time. One officer leaned forward, headset still on his voice reverberating with awe. "This feels real," he said. "If you can scale this, you'll change the way we train." My chest tightened, relief and fear mingling as I nodded. "We can scale?" After 2 hours of questions, the papers slid across the table. My name waited on the signature line. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling so badly I had to steady it with my other. When the ink touched the page, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The contract was ours. That night I stayed late at the office, the lights dim around me, the city glowing through the glass walls. I laid the contract on my desk, tracing the embossed seal with my finger. My team had gone home to celebrate, but I sat in silence staring at the evidence that everything I had fought for was finally recognized at the highest level. I thought of my father's words of his laughter when he mocked me for chasing toys, of Michael's smirk, his condos, his tie gleaming on the Zoom screen, and I thought of the contract in front of me signed and sealed a doorway into a future they couldn't begin to imagine. I could have called them then. I could have told them everything. But instead I closed my laptop, slid the contract into my drawer and locked it. Let them think I was still small. Let them believe I was broke. The truth was growing quietly and steadily, and one day when it could no longer be denied, it would burn brighter than their scorn. The house glittered the way it always did at Thanksgiving. Golden chandeliers, crystal glasses catching the light, candles flickering against polished silver. The air smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey. But beneath it all was the same sharp edge I'd grown up with. I had flown in from San Francisco that morning, my bag still smelling faintly of the coffee I spilled on it in the airport, and walked through the front door wearing jeans and a plain black sweater. I could feel their eyes take me in, measuring, dismissing. Michael's suit jacket hugged his shoulders like armor, his Rolex flashing with every gesture. My father greeted me with a distracted nod before turning back to brag about Michael's new penthouse. My mother kissed my cheek lightly, already moving toward the kitchen to check on the pumpkin pies. By the time we sat at the long mahogany table, I knew how the night would go. It always did. Halfway through the meal, Heather leaned forward, her pearl earrings swinging as she smirked at me. "So, Natalie," she said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "are you sure you can afford to be here this year? Should we start passing a hat around for you?" The laughter came instantly. Aunts and uncles chuckled. Michael grinned into his wineglass. Even my father's lips twitched with satisfaction. Only my mother avoided looking at me, fussing with the edge of her napkin as though it had suddenly become fascinating. I pressed my fork into the turkey on my plate, the prongs cutting deep until the meat shredded. My throat tightened, but I kept my face calm. This wasn't new. The sting was familiar, dulled by repetition. Still, something in me shifted as their laughter filled the room. I felt a hand brush against mine under the table. "Rachel." My younger cousin leaned slightly toward me. She was studying law now, her dark eyes steady and unflinching. In a whisper meant only for me, she said, "Don't let them get to you. One day they'll regret it." I blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. The words slipped through the cracks in my armor and lodged themselves somewhere deep. I turned my head just enough to meet her gaze, and a small, sharp smile curved my lips. The others carried on their attention back on Michael, who had launched into a story about closing another deal about colleagues who called him indispensable. Applause and laughter circled the table again, but my focus stayed on Rachel's words, replaying them over and over like a secret refrain. I cut another piece of turkey, chewing, slowly, swallowing past the lump in my throat. I let the noise blur around me, the voices fading into background static. My chest no longer ached with humiliation. It tightened instead with resolve. They thought I had nothing. They thought my silence meant surrender. But every slight was fuel, every laugh a reminder. I lifted my glass, letting the wine brush my lips before setting it back down, steady and deliberate. Rachel caught the gesture, her mouth curving in the faintest smile. By the time dessert arrived, their laughter had dulled in my ears. I tasted pumpkin pie and ash. my stomach heavy with something stronger than food. I watched my father toast Michael again, watched my mother beam as though the entire world had been built for him. I sat in their shadows, outwardly quiet, but inside, I was building something sharper than words. The night ended with hugs at the door, coats pulled tight against the chill November air. My father clapped Michael on the back, declaring once more that he was proud. When his eyes flicked to me, he said nothing. I stepped outside into the cold, my breath frosting in the air. The laughter from inside carried faintly to the porch, muffled by glass and distance. I tightened my coat and walked toward the rental car waiting at the curb, the headlights cutting across the driveway. Rachel slipped out just as I reached for the handle. "Hey," she said softly, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. I meant what I said. I nodded. "I know." She gave my arm a squeeze before heading back in her figure, swallowed by the warm glow of the house. I slid behind the wheel, the engine rumbling to life. As I pulled away, the house shrank in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my jaw set. The humiliation was theirs to believe in, but the truth was mine to carry. One day, when the mask finally dropped, their laughter would choke in their throats. And I would be ready. By 2022, the office didn't smell like detergent anymore. Visionary Realms had traded its cramped loft for 3 full floors in a sleek San Francisco tower, the kind with glass walls that reflected the Bay Bridge at sunset. The air inside buzzed with the rhythm of more than 300 employees. Engineers in hoodies huddled around whiteboards, project managers pacing with headsets, designers pinning mock-ups along the walls. Contracts streamed in, and for the first time our annual revenue crossed $300 million. On paper, the company was valued at $6 billion. I should have felt untouchable. Instead, I carried the weight of knowing my family still thought I was nothing. Uncle Robert showed up unannounced one afternoon, his cologne filling the lobby before I even saw him. He hadn't bothered with me in years except to chuckle at my expense during holiday dinners. Now he wore a practiced smile, spreading his arms as if we'd always been close. "Natalie," he said warmly, "what an empire you've built. It's incredible." I was thinking, maybe it's time to bring some of this back to the family. We should keep those shares in-house, don't you think? I studied him across the conference table, his cufflinks gleaming his hand, resting casually on the polished surface. My team sat quietly watching, waiting for my cue. I leaned back in my chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Funny," I said, my voice calm. "I don't remember being family when you laughed me out of the room. I don't recall you offering help when I slept on a mattress on the floor. But now that there's something worth taking suddenly, we're blood again." His smile faltered. He adjusted his tie. "Business is business. No hard feelings." I shook my head slowly. "I built this without you. I don't owe you a seat at my table." For a moment, silence stretched thin. He stood muttering something about missed opportunities and left. My team exhaled in unison. I didn't. That fall, I flew home for another family gathering. The house looked the same as always. Warm lights glowing in the windows, the smell of roast beef drifting down the driveway. Inside voices overlapped, laughter swelled, and Michael held court at the center of it all. He wore a sharp suit, his hair slicked back, his glass raised high. "I just closed another deal," he announced, "our firm's biggest this quarter. 9 figures, and the partners said it couldn't have been done without me." Applause filled the room. My father clapped him on the back so hard his cufflinks rattled. My mother's eyes shone with pride. The spotlight might as well have been fixed on him. I slipped quietly into my seat, invisible as always. Later, as plates were cleared and dessert was served, my father's voice carried above the chatter. "If Natalie had any real value," he said, gesturing loosely toward me, "she would have proven it by now. But we all know these little projects are illusions. Toys. She's lucky we indulged the idea of it." Laughter followed, polite and sharp. My fork hovered above my pie, my chest tightening. I pressed the utensil into the crust until it cracked, forcing myself not to look up, not to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, I repeated Rachel's words from the year before, "One day they'll regret it." When the evening ended, I returned to my hotel room, the city outside wrapped in silence. My phone buzzed on the desk, an email notification lighting the screen. Subject: time. Magazine. Cover feature. Confirmation. I opened it slowly, scanning the words twice before they settled. They had chosen me for their end-of-year issue. My name would sit on a cover read across the country. I printed the confirmation at the front desk, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my wallet. The paper pressed against me like a secret, a weapon, a promise. I didn't tell anyone. Not my team, not Tom, not even Rachel. At the next family dinner, when my father inevitably raised his glass to Michael, when my mother's eyes shone with pride only for him when Heather's smirk found its way across the table, I would sit quietly, the folded paper against my heart, and wait. The roar of the NASDAQ floor still rang in my ears as I sat alone later that night. Earlier that morning, Visionary Realms had gone public. The ticker flashed across massive screens in Times Square. Cameras clicked, voices shouted my name into microphones. $9 billion. 15% of that was mine. $1.35 billion. Numbers I'd once scribbled in notebooks as impossible daydreams now scrolled across the bottom of financial news broadcasts. The world was celebrating. My phone buzzed nonstop with congratulations reporters begging for comments, old classmates suddenly remembering my number. Even a few relatives tried calling, though I ignored them all. I turned every screen to silent. I didn't want their voices in my ears yet. Instead, I drove across San Francisco, away from the gleaming tower of my new headquarters, back to the small apartment I'd never let go of. The Civic still coughed as it pulled into the lot, the same crooked parking lines and broken lights greeting me like old friends. I carried nothing but my laptop bag inside the cracked paint and water stains on the ceiling, unchanged after all these years. I kicked off my shoes, sat cross-legged on the floor where I'd once coded through the night, and opened my computer. Emails poured in by the hundreds. At the top of the list was one I'd been waiting for. Subject: time. Cover feature. Final proof. I clicked, and the screen filled with the mock-up of their end-of-year issue. My own face stared back at me, sharper now, framed by the headline, "The Youngest Tech Billionaire Redefining VR." For a long moment, I didn't breathe. My chest rose and fell shallowly as though the air had thickened in the room. I traced the words with my eyes again and again, half expecting them to vanish. I thought of my father's laugh when he called my work toys, of Michael's smirk through the glow of his Zoom camera, of Heather's voice cutting across the Thanksgiving table offering to pass a hat around for me. They had always needed me to stay small so they could feel big. I leaned back against the wall, letting the glow of the laptop bathe the room. The same wall where I had once rested my head in exhaustion, ramen cups stacked in the corner, coffee stains marking the carpet. Now those ghosts sat with me in silence, bearing witness. The city outside was alive with honking cars and cheering crowds, but here only the hum of my laptop kept me company. As I folded the printed proof I'd requested from Time earlier that day, smoothed it flat with trembling hands, and slid it into my wallet. The paper felt heavier than it should, dense with years of humiliation and every insult I had endured. I shut my laptop and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow I would board a flight to Chicago. The house would be glowing with warm lights, the table set with turkey and cranberry sauce, every glass raised to Michael before a word was said to me. They'd think I was still the poor daughter, the broke cousin, the shadow of the Hayes family. Let them. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile no one in that house had ever recognized. I wasn't going to shout my triumph or throw it in their faces before the moment came. Timing was everything. When I stepped back into that dining room, surrounded by the same laughter that had always excluded me, the truth would fall on them like thunder. And for once, I wouldn't have to say a single word. The chandelier shimmered above us, scattering light across polished silverware and crystal glasses, as if the room itself had been staged for a performance. My father raised his glass higher, his words still hanging in the air, sharp enough to slice through flesh. Around the table, laughter rippled like a tide. Michael basked in it, shoulders squared with practiced ease, his Rolex catching the glow each time he lifted his fork. Heather smirked across the table, her lipstick marking the rim of her glass in crimson half-moons. Uncle Robert leaned back, shaking his head with theatrical amusement. I sat still. My fork pressed lightly into the edge of my plate, steady as my pulse thudded slow and deliberate. A small smile curled at my lips, invisible to anyone not looking closely. Inside the words looped like a mantra the last time you get to laugh. The table settled into its rhythm again. My father launched into another speech about Michael's firm, about how his name carried weight in every boardroom he entered. My mother nodded along, pearls glinting her eyes warm with pride. Cousins whispered about promotions and vacations, their voices swelling with self-importance. I kept my gaze lowered, but my ears caught everything. Each chuckle, each dismissive remark, every polished jab tossed my way was a spark added to the fire I carried in silence. Heather leaned forward, her perfume heavy, her tone dripping sweet poison. "So, Natalie," she said, tilting her head just enough for the chandelier's glow to catch her earrings. "How's that freelancing going? Must be unpredictable. Hard to keep the lights on, I imagine." Michael chuckled, lifting his wine glass. "Don't be cruel, Heather. She's always been resourceful. I'm sure she scrapes by somehow." The laughter bubbled again. My father tapped the table with 2 fingers, the sound like a gavel. "Unpredictable doesn't pay bills," he said smoothly. "That's why stability matters. If you'd followed Michael's path, Natalie, you wouldn't be treading water." My mother reached for her glass, her voice gentle but cutting. "We just want you settled, sweetheart. By now you should have something steady, not still chasing ideas." "Ideas?" She made the words sound like a curse. I let the silence swallow their words. My hand curled around my glass, the stem cool against my palm, my expression calm. Rage didn't show on my face anymore. It had been replaced with something sharper, something colder. Rachel, seated at the far end, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes flicked between me and Michael. Her lip caught between her teeth. I saw her chest rise with a breath, as if she wanted to speak, but the room's energy pressed her back down. She stayed silent. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his grin easy, opportunistic. "Maybe Michael can help her out," he said, his tone mocking. "Get her a real job at the firm, keep things in the family." Michael grinned wider, pretending to wave it off, but he didn't deny it. The room erupted again in laughter. Even my mother's lips curled, though she hid it behind her glass. I sat straighter, my smile still in place. My fork moved slowly across the porcelain, dragging through cranberry sauce like paint on a canvas. No one noticed how steady my hands were. No one noticed how calm I had become. Their laughter didn't wound me anymore. It was background noise, the same as the clinking of silver or the rustle of napkins. They thought they were breaking me down one joke at a time. What they didn't know was that they were sharpening me word by word. The waiter appeared with another bottle of champagne, pouring fresh flutes around the table. His eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, the corners of his mouth twitching with recognition. He set my glass down carefully, his voice polite, neutral. "Refill, miss?" I nodded once, deliberate. The fizz bubbled up golden and alive as though it knew what was coming. My father raised his glass again, sealing the evening with another toast. "To family," he said proudly, his eyes sliding toward Michael before glancing past me like I wasn't even there. "And to the ones who make the right choices." Crystals clinked. Laughter swelled. I lifted my glass at last, the faint smile never leaving my face. The stem didn't tremble between my fingers. My silence was complete, heavy, sharp. And in that silence, I thought only one thing: enjoy it, because the ground beneath you is already shifting. The laughter was still spilling around the table when my father's phone buzzed against the polished wood. The vibration was loud, insistent, slicing through the noise until every eye turned toward him. He frowned, glanced at the screen, and his face shifted into that careful professional mask he wore only for people above him. "Excuse me," he muttered, lifting the phone to his ear. "Yes, this is Richard." The room hushed as his voice carried. "Merry Christmas to you too, Tom. What's that?" "Oh, yes, she's here." His gaze flicked across the table, landing on me for a split second before darting away. I watched his knuckles tighten around the glass stem of his wine as his colleague's voice bled faintly into the silence. "Congratulations, Richard. Time just named your daughter the youngest tech billionaire in the country. Hell of an achievement for the Hayes family." Every sound vanished. Forks hovered in midair, spoons frozen halfway to mouths. Michael's grin collapsed, his jaw going slack. Heather's smirk dissolved into an open-mouthed stare, her painted lips parting as though words had deserted her. My father's throat bobbed as he swallowed. What? That must be some mistake." His voice wavered, the control slipping. Yes, I'll check. Thank you." He ended the call too quickly, pressing the phone flat against the table as though willing it silent. The chandelier hummed faintly above us. No one spoke. The only sound was the fizz of champagne bubbling in forgotten glasses. My father turned his head, slowly, eyes locking on mine. They were wide, unsteady, searching for denial. His lips parted, then closed again, his composure cracking in real time. Michael cleared his throat, but no words came. His hand twitched as he set down his fork, the clink ringing louder than it should have. Heather's eyes darted between us, her mouth still hanging open. I lifted my glass steady, deliberate, and took a sip. The wine slid cool and smooth down my throat. I set the glass back on the table, the sound sharp in the silence. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The weight of everything they'd said moments before, the jokes, the dismissals, the humiliation, hung thick in the air, suffocating. No one laughed now. No one dared. My father's hands twitched where they rested on the tablecloth. He opened his mouth again, but nothing emerged. His eyes darted to Michael, then back to me as though searching for an escape route in a room where none existed. I held his gaze, calm, unflinching. The silence stretched longer, heavier, pressing into every corner of the room until even the chandelier seemed frozen mid-sparkle. Their laughter had died, and all that remained was the truth, pulsing like a storm just beyond the walls. And I let the silence do what words never could. The silence cracked when the television in the corner flickered to life. My father had left it on mute earlier for football highlights, but now the screen glowed with a breaking news banner. A familiar magazine cover filled the frame. Bold letters stretching across the image. Time. The youngest tech billionaire redefining VR. My own face stared back at them, standing on the NASDAQ floor, cameras flashing as confetti rained down. The photo caught me mid-smile, flanked by my team, our company logo blazing across the ticker. The words beneath it were undeniable, stamped into history. A crystal glass slipped from Heather's hand, shattering against the hardwood. She gasped, eyes wide, lips trembling as though she might protest, but nothing came. Michael's face drained of color, the confidence stripped clean, his mouth opening and closing like he'd forgotten how to form words. My mother pressed a hand to her pearls, her fingers shaking so violently the strand clicked against itself. My father's jaw clenched. He straightened in his chair, reaching for composure like a drowning man for air. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "perhaps this is an opportunity. Maybe we can build something together. Family ventures investments. We could—" I cut him off, my voice sharp, steady. "I built all of this without you. I don't owe you anything." His eyes flashed, the practiced authority in them dimming. He had no gavel here, no courtroom to command. Uncle Robert leaned forward, ever the opportunist. "Natalie," he said with false warmth, "if it's all true—" "And clearly it is. Why not let me buy a stake? Keep it in the family where it belongs." I turned to him, slowly meeting his gaze. "Family?" I asked, my tone colder than the November wind outside. "When I was sleeping on a mattress eating ramen, where were you? When I begged for respect and you laughed, where were you then?" He flinched, his smile faltering. The table went still again. No one daring to speak. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of wood against marble cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned eyes wide as I rose to my feet. I don't owe you partnership. I don't owe you forgiveness. And I will not rewrite history so you can pretend you stood beside me. The chandelier sparkled above its light, scattering across their stunned faces. My father's knuckles whitened around his fork. My mother's eyes glistened. Michael stared at the table as if the grain of the wood might save him. Heather sat frozen, her smirk shattered beyond repair. Rachel's voice, soft but firm, slipped through the quiet. "They've already paid the price," she whispered, her words carrying more weight than the silence itself. I looked at her, offering the smallest nod. Then I turned toward the door. The dining room remained hushed as I walked away, each step measured, final. No one rose to stop me. No one dared. The empire they had mocked now towered over them, and their power crumbled into silence. Outside, the cold night air wrapped around me like armor. The limousine waited at the curb, its engine humming low. The driver opened the door with a respectful nod. I paused for a moment, glancing back at the glowing windows of the house. Inside, voices rose in frantic murmurs, desperate attempts to piece together pride from the ruins. I didn't need to hear them. The reckoning had already happened. Sliding into the warmth of the car, I leaned back against the leather seat, exhaling slowly. For years, their words had pierced me, had bent me small. Tonight, my silence had been louder than every insult combined. Some words had once broken me. Now their absence was my victory. My quiet had become their punishment. And as the city lights stretched out before me, endless and alive, one thought echoed steady in my mind. If the family who doubted you is forced to bow to your truth, do you forgive them, or let them live forever with their regret?